Hello and welcome. In today's video, I'm going to share with you my top 10 favourite Ark Tames. But just before we get into it, make sure to like and subscribe as it really does help out the channel. In at number 10 is the Crystal Wyvern. Now these things came out when Crystal Isles came out, and these things in my opinion are a lot better than the Wyvern in so many aspects. These things are by far much easier to tame, just requiring a passive tame using the crystals found on Crystal Isles. It is so simple, and it can even be your first tame on the map. And once you have one of these things tamed, they are insanely useful for so many things. They can pick up a wealth of different creatures, which really makes them very convenient. Their weight stat is very decent for metal harvesting when that comes later on. And also, these things have great speed and agility just for general travel around the map. And they deal a very reasonable amount of damage on top of that as well. Especially if you are going for the Blood Crystal Wyvern, which is definitely my preferred option. The Crystal Wyvern is a must-have on Crystal Isles, and it is accessible to every Ark player that has Ark, as Crystal Isles is obviously a free DLC. There is no reason why you should not tame a Crystal Wyvern. Its uses are just so good, and the fact that it's such an easy tame means this is one of the best creatures in Ark, in my opinion. In at number 9 is the Snow Owl. Now this is a creature also accessible to every Ark player out there, as this thing is available on maps like Fjorda, which I'm really thankful for, as a great creature in my opinion should be accessible to all of Ark's players. And it really does make the creature so much more useful if every Ark player can actually use the thing instead of the people that have just paid for the DLCs. Firstly, to do with the Snow Owl has an absolutely insane glide ability, which it also does share with the Griffin. And compared to the Griffin, it just feels so much smoother and snappier than any other flyer, and even the Griffin itself. But in terms of PvP use, these things have a wealth of great abilities for that too. Firstly, they have this kind of heat seeking ability, where they can seek out any Ark organism that is listed across the map. This is great if you think someone is trying to raid your base, or someone has raided your base and you've simply lost them. You can just activate this and quickly find them, then pick them up with the Snow Owl and dispose of them as you wish. But in terms of the Snow Owl, you're also going to want to crank that stamina, as their stamina equates to how long they can heal creatures for in that frozen healing state that they have. But just do really take into mind that this will heal every creature in the vicinity. It won't just heal your tamed creatures, which you should really take into mind, as sometimes that may not be what you want if you're trying to kill the enemy. So in that case, a Daedon would be much more useful for healing your creatures. Or if you have access on PC to mods, then mods could be a good solution for you as well if you are playing on single player worlds. In at number 8 is the Mantis. Now again, this creature is accessible on Raasclark, which means every Ark player can tame this thing. And I would definitely say Raasclark is the go-to map for taming this thing, as where they spawn on Raasclark is a lot less harsh of a location than it is on Scorched Earth, and you do not need to kill death worms on Raasclark in order to actually tame the Mantis. You can kill woolly rhinos as well if you would prefer, but both still do spawn on the map, so you can really pick and choose there. Once you have tamed the Mantis, which is a little bit laborious, requiring you to have a ghillie suit, bug repellent, and for you to passive feed it woolly rhino horns or those deathworm horns, you have yourself an insanely good harvester, and also a great boss creature for killing the Manticore on Scorched Earth as well. On Raasclark, I will equip the swords onto this thing and just go ham on all of the overseers around the area and gather up all of that mutton, which is an extremely useful resource for just taming creatures, as sometimes I can't really be bothered with getting kibble, and mutton is the second best option, and it does keep a lot better than things like prime meat. And especially for me, having a mod for stacking, I really have no worries keeping all of that mutton. but sadly on official, mutton does not stack. Obviously, as you've seen here, the Mantis's main ability is wielding melee weapons. In at number 7 is the Argy or Argentavis, or as Squid says it, Argentavis. I will still never get over that minor mistake he made there. Either way, the Argentavis is an extremely useful creature that everyone again has access to, as this thing spawns on the island. So literally everyone has access to it, even mobile and Switch players that may not have access to all the free DLCs available. The Argentavis is by far one of the best creatures for gathering any kind of metal, as this thing has an insanely good weight stat, and it also has weight reduction on things like metal, crystal and obsidian. Also, the Argentavis can pick up a wealth of creatures as well, and if you pair this thing with an Anki that you have tamed, you can gather metal like never before. It really is an absolutely insane creature for getting all of that metal and all of those resources. Obviously, this thing can't harvest metal itself, but is an extremely useful tool in the metal gathering process. Also, on top of all of that, this thing has a wealth of other great abilities as well. Like, its saddle works as a portable smithy, which means if your metal weapons break while you're farming, you can just quickly repair it in the Argy. And also, they do regen insanely quickly when they eat a dead body. In at number 6 is the Carcharodontosaurus. Now, the Carcharodontosaurus is a very recent addition to Ark, and the Giga would have been in this spot. But the Carcharodontosaurus, in my opinion, is just so much of a better carnivore for the job that the Giga did, that the Giga does not warrant being on this list, in my opinion. But if you are thinking about taming a Giga, it doesn't mean the Giga is a bad creature. I still think the Giga is a very valid and viable creature for that need of a really strong carnivore. So if you have tamed a Giga, don't feel bad that you've tamed one. But the reason why I say the Carcharodontosaurus is so much better and so much more worth it is mainly its mobility. This thing's stamina doesn't suck like hell, and also this thing can move extremely fast compared to what the Giga has, which just means this creature is so much nicer to use than the Giga, as I'm not constantly frustrated that I've just run out of stamina. Also, when the Blood Rage ability is fully activated, this creature will be doing more damage than the Giga, but when the Blood Rage isn't activated, the Giga will do more damage than the Carcharodontosaurus. In terms of taming, this thing requires no tranks. It is simply a bit of a passive tame, and then it has a sort of mini game on top of that as well. You will need to feed it dead creatures until its taming bar above it goes green, and then you'll just need to absolutely decimate everything into land until that taming reaches 100%. In at number 5 is the Carnotaurus. Now, in my opinion, the Carno has always been the go-to creature for me, and I probably have a lot of bias since Squid's Ark series, where he tamed a Carno and named it Carny Dave. For me, back in those days of early Ark stages, the Carno was just the ultimate creature, as I couldn't even think of taming a Rex yet, and I didn't want something as low tier as a raptor, as I really didn't see any enjoyment in taming one. I just wanted to tame a Carno, as Squid tamed one, and they just looked so cool, and they had the power which I really needed at the time. Also, Carnotaurus, translated from Latin, means meatball, and that is why my first Carnotaurus I ever tamed, I called that thing Meatball, and the second one, in honor of Carny Dave, I called Carny Dave. I wasn't very original with namings back then, and at this point in my Ark journey, I will always name my Carno Meatball, and I rarely even name my dinos, so it is really special when I actually do name one of my creatures, as it means I'm really attached to that creature. But most of the creatures I tame, I don't even name. Also, since the TLC, the Carnotaurus is even better than ever before. Its second attack deals a wealth of bleed damage, which is an extremely useful thing to have on a carnivore. Not even the Rex has that. And also, its first attack in general just deals a very good amount of damage. The Carnotaurus is a very strong carnivore that doesn't seem to get stuck on things, as it is a very nice size, and it can be unlocked in the mid-level 50s. In at number 4 is the Rock Drake. Now, the Rock Drake is really an insane tame, which at some point, if you have access to tame one of these things, it is definitely worth it. But you'll 100% need to come prepared, as the Rock Drake is not a tame to be underestimated. You will certainly need some sort of creature to be able to get that egg out of the Rock Drake nest and deliver it back to your home safely. Also, you will need air conditioners. Don't even bother with torches, as the Rock Drake's egg temperature is so specific and so out of range of torches. You would just need so much to even get that egg incubating, so it really is not worth it. Just save up for the air conditioners, and once you have raised yourself this Rock Drake, you'll be glad that you actually spent all of that time preparing and getting a high level one, as these things are absolutely insane for so many things. Firstly, you can kind of call them flyers. Yes, they are gliders, but they can dash across the map with insane speed. And usually I prefer a glider over a flyer unless I'm traveling over really long distances on really flat pieces of ground. Like in the case of Crystal Isles, the Rock Drake isn't great as there aren't too many things to latch onto, but in the case of Arboration, that thing is littered with places to grab onto and latch onto, which makes the Rock Drake really useful. So on more traditional Ark maps, the Rock Drake may not be your best shout, as it doesn't have a wealth of things to grab onto, but it still can be very useful. And also, especially on Arboration, this thing is great for choosing through Rockroll with absolute ease. Definitely a strat you should try at some point. In at number 3 is the Shadow Mane. Now sadly this thing doesn't have a dossier, so that's why that picture was there instead of a dossier picture, but that doesn't mean Wildcard didn't care about this creature. Certainly not. The Shadow Mane is by far one of the best Ark creatures in the game, and it was introduced very recently, and luckily now can be found on maps like the Order, so it is accessible to people who didn't just buy Genesis Part 2, and I am so glad for it, as the Shadow Mane is by far one of the best Ark tames, having so much agility and also having a wealth of buffs on top of that. It has the hydration buff, it has the pack buff, it has alpha buffs, and also on top of all of that, it has the ability to go invisible as well, which really makes this creature an insane feat of Ark taming. Also, it's a great swimmer as well, but sadly this thing's taming method is an absolute hell to get through. The Shadow Mane may seem like a simple tame on paper, but trust me, you will struggle a lot through taming one, but you'll be glad that you did. In at number 2 is the Baryonyx. Now you may certainly not agree with this thing being so high on the list, but this is my top 10 creatures, not yours, and you can always feel free to comment your top 10 in the comments down below, as I'd really like to hear your thoughts on my picks and also what you generally use and what creatures you like as well. But the reason why I prefer the Baryonyx over the Shadow Mane is just I find myself using this creature so much more, and especially for caves I always find myself coming back to the Baryonyx and not using things like Shadow Manes for caves, as I'm just so much more used to using the Baryonyx and I like all of the features that it has. Sadly this thing does not have the hydration buff, even though it would make sense if it did. Also this thing does only eat fish, which can be a bit of an inconvenience, but really coelacanths aren't that hard to kill and I don't struggle with getting fish meat too much. Now, one of the main reasons why I use this is because of their spin ability, which you can access by pressing C on the keyboard. This only works on water, by the way, so sadly you cannot use this on land dinos, but in the water you can stun creatures up to the size of a megalodon, which really is overpowered, and it makes this thing great for doing underwater caves, especially considering this thing isn't an underwater creature and it is actually overall a very easy tame, and you really will not struggle with it, especially if you have the net gun. Otherwise you'll just need to make a very basic stone trap. These things really aren't difficult to tame, maybe about 20 tranks for a level 150, or if in some cases it's a bit higher, maybe you'll go for 40 tranks. I'll always bring about 50, and you will certainly be good for the tame. And finally, in at number 1 is the Maywing. And again, like the Shadowmane, this thing doesn't have a dossier. What are you doing, Wildcard? How do you not have a dossier for these things yet? But that also doesn't mean, like the Shadowmane, that Wildcard didn't put so much care and attention into these creatures. And the Maywing is my favourite creature in Ark by far, and can be found on maps like the Order. The Maywing is just such an easy tame to get, and especially if you have a net gun, these things are by far some of the easiest tames in the game, just requiring a bit of meat and one simple net projectile with maybe about 20 to 30 tranks. These things couldn't tame any easier. Once tamed though, you've got yourself an insanely good glider, which in my opinion glides significantly better than the Rock Drake and significantly faster. Yes, it doesn't have some of those dashing abilities like the Rock Drake has, and it loses out in the damage department, but for travel and many other things, this thing is just so much better. Especially if you are raising any kind of baby dinos, as this thing works as a portable feeding trough, and it can also steal enemy babies as well if you're into that in a PvP scenario. And actually, on top of all of that, they are great gatherers of berries as well. If the belly flop onto berries, they actually gather pretty well. First up, we have got ourselves the Quetzal, and this creature in my opinion is one which is extremely underrated, mainly due to its speed, as a lot of people just say, well, it's so slow, I literally can't use this thing. It is the most useless creature out there, and albeit I do admit that its speed is pretty slow for most people's standards, it still is an extremely useful creature for any general task which you may do in any given Ark scenario. For PvP players and for PvE players, it works both ways, as you can use these things as great metal gatherers, albeit they don't gather metal, they just transfer metal, so maybe resource transferers. And you can even build a base on the back of this thing as well, which can actually be a pretty OP strat in some PvP situations, although I would probably go with a Raft base over a Quetz base, but definitely for PvE use it is a really cool thing to have, and I don't really get why people don't talk about these things quite as much anymore. Next up, we have got the carb enemies, and most people probably just view this creature as a source of keratin, and albeit it is a great source of keratin, if you need keratin, always kill a carb enemies. That's just the way you go. Chitin's a lot easier to get from insects, by the way, and you generally get a lot more of it, so I wouldn't generally get keratin for things like saddles, but if you want to have keratin, then you can get keratin from these things. But the thing is, with this creature, it is a great window into the underwater world of Ark, and it's the only real underwater able creature that I'm putting on this list. Like, none of the other creatures here are really great underwater creatures, but maybe apart from the next one actually when I'm thinking about it. But this creature is a really great opening creature into, let's say, ocean exploration, because it's reasonably quick in the water, albeit it's not going to be the fastest, and it spawns on land, so you don't need to go into the ocean, albeit an Ichthyosaurus can be obtained pretty easily these days, and, you know, across all time really, but there's loads of traps if you want to do that for an Ichthyosaurus. Not really strictly necessary, but they spawn in shallow areas and you can get those. But having a carb in the early stages to get some of that oil gathered in the early stages just really seems to help me out. Next up, we have the Beelzebufo, and this creature has to be here. Come on, the king of cementing paste gathering. And albeit some of you may just say, well, this isn't an underrated creature at all, and it's like the best creature for me pretty much because I can get so much cementing paste with it. A lot of people don't use it, and I used to be one of those people a couple of months ago, and I've switched to this thing now, and I really can't go back. Like, it's so consistent in the way it gathers any kind of cementing paste. There's only really one kind, but you can technically say there's many because there's loads of different ways of getting it. I would usually get it from beaver dams, and quite a lot of Ark players do. It's just really easy, and you could obviously craft it as well, but that is quite slow. Whereas with this thing, you can just kill loads of insects, go into the insect cave on the island, and boom, you can have tens of thousands of cementing paste, and you might actually be encumbered because of all of that. But either way, you can just get so much with this thing. It really has to be on this list, and it is also a pretty good underwater creature as well. You know, it really does have quite a lot of agility underwater, albeit it doesn't pack the most amount of damage. it still is extremely useful, especially in ASA actually now, as insects no longer have levels. In at number 7, we have the Baryonyx, and this creature had to be here in my opinion, and a lot of people are actually moving over to creatures like the Shadowmane now for all of their caving needs, but I really do think the Baryonyx deserves a place on the list, and actually deserves a place in everyone's Ark life for being a great caving creatures, albeit the Shadowmane can do a hell of a lot more than the Baryonyx in quite a lot of aspects. The Baryonyx can also do a couple of things which, you know, the Shadowmane can't. The first main advantage actually to this thing is its taming method is so much easier, and you can obviously, because of that, get it much earlier in the game, and also it can stun creatures underwater as well. Albeit, yeah, not the biggest edge over the Shadowmane, I still think it really has a very useful place as a very great caving creature, and I've used these things for years and years now, and albeit, yes, Shadowmanes are great for doing cave runs, I still always come back to this creature. It's just the general basics for me. I know how to use this creature really well and effectively, and I don't really think that I need anything more than a Baryonyx. And albeit a Shadowmane can be very useful and all, but if I think that you don't really need anything more than the Baryonyx, then maybe do you actually need more than the Baryonyx? And this thing is very easily possible. Not to say that it's a bad creature, it's like, oh, well, you don't really need anything more than it. It is still a very great creature, it's much easier to get your hands on. Next up, we have got the Dimorphodon, and this is a very brief entry, obviously, because the BR for this thing is really short, because there's not too much to say, but they're just really great small pack flying creatures, and they could deal a heck of a lot of damage, especially to players, as they do player-based damage instead of rider-based damage, which can play a huge advantage in a lot of scenarios, and I think people don't give this creature enough credit, and that's why it's on this list. And next up, in the number 5 spot, of course, we have the Carnotaurus. And most people will just be like, well, the Aloe's better. There's nothing more to say. But we're talking about underrated creatures here, and obviously the Aloe isn't really too much of an underrated creature. Yeah, the Rex gets a lot more attention than it, and the Giga gets a lot more attention than the Aloe. But I think the Carno gets even less attention, and especially less attention than this creature actually deserves, as this pretty much my favorite Ark creature. But I'm not going to be so biased and just put my favorite Ark creature right then in number 1 spot, because there are a lot of other Ark creatures which are extremely useful to me, and this is, yes, albeit my favorite, it's still, in my opinion, doesn't deserve to be in the number 1 spot, as there are some more useful underrated creatures, and my personal and emotional bias, I'm not going to play a huge factor into this video, because, you know, I'm making this for you, I'm not making it for me. If I was making it for me, they'd kind of be right in the number 1 spot, but I'm making it for you, so I'm slightly generalising my list here. The reason why I think the Carno is so good, I don't know why it's taken me so long, I've just blabbered on about everything. It deals the bleed ability, it's relatively small compared to things like the Aloe, it does a sizable amount of damage, it's got a good health stat, and it's got good mobility. And albeit its weight isn't perfect, it could definitely be a little bit higher, still is really an ideal creature for me. When I think of a carnivore, I go straight to the Carno, and they're ridiculously easy to tame too, especially in ASA, because you can just kill the parents and then press E on that baby, if obviously there's a baby relative to the parents of the Carnotauruses. Next up, we have got the Megalosaurus, and loads of people really like this creature, and I've heard them in my comments, but when I think of bigger Ark YouTubers and when they do their top 10s, I never really hear this creature being mentioned, unless maybe in an aberration circumstance, and albeit they're really useful then, the nighttime still makes up quite a big proportion of your Ark playtime, especially if you're on Operation, then it's 100% of it. But we're not going to be talking about how great this thing is in Operation, because that's pretty much when this creature gets brought up, all everyone talks about. No, on any map, as soon as it turns into nightfall, this creature is so deadly, and it really does pack a punch, and it can even carry creatures around in its mouth and absolutely tear them to shreds to actually save me from a huge clan of Microraptors, if that's even a thing. But yeah, they really do pack a punch in terms of the damage department. They will tear things like the Carno to shreds, even things like Rexes and Alphas and all of that. They can just take out with so much ease, and they're such a small, like, versatile carnivore. It really does help them that they have all of this power behind it, as they're very mobile, very easy to use, very easy to control, and actually, frankly, pretty easy to control. Tame, that's what I meant. Did I something. Either way, they're pretty much easy in every aspect. not as actually so easy to tame in the location they're in, but the actual taming method is very simple. I've kind of gone a bit off here, but you know, it's essentially the Troodon on loads of steroids, and it's so much easier to tame than a Troodon. If the Troodon would never make this list, of course, but yeah, the Megalosaurus is in at number 4. Next up, we have the Velonosaur, and for me, this is just the upgraded Megalosaurus. It deals tons of damage, it can deal range damage, and it's around for all the day. It doesn't just need to be around at night time, albeit the Megalosaurus definitely has its place on this list. The Velonosaur is my preferred creature, and you know, some people may not agree with that. Do you agree with that? Are you a Velonosaur or a Megalosaurus person, or a Carnotaurus person, or a Baryonyx person, or what's your preferred kind of small carnivore? I know I've done many small carnivore top 10 lists before, but I actually want to know what your favourite small carnivores are, so make sure to comment that down below. And, you know, when I think of the Velonosaur, I really do think of sheer power, and albeit when you level up its melee, its actual turrets don't increase in damage. If you just crank that stamina stat like I just did there, you can fire these things for ages into creatures and just absolutely decimate them. And I had a ridiculously high level theory here. It was in the 1000 somethings, and I didn't force tame a particularly high level Velonosaur, so it is kind of looking like it takes ages in this scenario. And obviously you wouldn't use them at this close of a range, but when you have a good level Velonosaur, you really can take out creatures like it's an FPS game, just straight like that. And that's why I absolutely love this creature. Now, the Crystal Wyvern has to be here on the list, and loads of people talk about the Wyvern just being so great and all that, and yes, I do think the Wyvern is a great creature. I just don't think it gets no, what am I thinking of? The Crystal Wyvern, sorry, doesn't get a good enough rep as it should, and the normal Wyverns get the reputation that the Crystal Wyverns should be getting as well, as they are kind of the same creature. It's just they don't come in the Wyvern trenches, and they've got another word in front of their name, so they must be worse variants of these creatures, which obviously are the Wyverns, which you'll know from Scorched Earth, as that's the map they released on. But they're far easier to tame than normal Wyverns, and the Blood Crystal Wyvern is my absolute favourite Wyvern. And the Lightning Wyvern doesn't even come close to the coolness and usefulness of the ability which you can get out of a Blood Crystal Wyvern. And again, I know I'm saying it again, they're so easy to tame. You just need to be level 65 and have been able to either knock out or kill Crystal Wyvern. I think it's knockout. And then you've got that Primal Crystal, and then you can simply just passive tame these things, and boom, like that, you have yourself a Wyvern. And albeit there's no saddles, so they have no armor, but normal Wyverns don't have that either. I really do think these creatures do deserve some consideration in a list of the most underrated creatures in 2024, as hardly anyone seems to talk about these things. And in at number 1, we have got the Bloodstalker, and I had to put this creature here, okay? I really like the Bloodstalker at the moment, and albeit, yes, you can maybe say it isn't the most underrated creature, but for the use that I use it for, I do think it is underrated, and that's why I've chucked it right in the number 1 spot. And as soon as I thought of making this video, this was the first creature that came to mind for me, so I was like, I have to put this thing in at the number 1 spot. It is the greatest water tame, in my opinion, with no comparison whatsoever. And yes, it doesn't have immunity to things like electric eels and jellyfish, but it's so quick, it can get out of there, like, you don't even have to think about it. It's just, it's so agile in the water, it can skim across the top of the water as well, and even if they do get you, it's not going to be the biggest issue. You can get yourself out of there, or you can handily deal the damage to take them all out as well. And they're not just useful in the water like most normal water creatures, which obviously just die if they're not in the water. No, these things can be taken out anywhere and used in all kinds of various situations that aren't in the water as well. And that's what makes this creature so good. And they're just so versatile, but mainly for underwater exploration, underwater travel, and just general underwater things. These are my preferred creature, and they're so good. Underwater caving, underwater getting into underwater bosses. I wouldn't actually bring them into the mode of boss fight. They're not really going to survive there. They're not boss fighting creatures, but for anything that you're already doing underwater apart from the mode of boss fight, these things are really your perfect creatures. And I don't get why people don't talk about these things being such great underwater creatures as much as I do. But anyway, that is the end of today's video, and I really hope that you all enjoyed this one. And as always, comment down below what is the most underrated Ark creature in 2024, as I want to know your thoughts, and do you agree with this list? And with that, I'll see you all later.